This is a mini lecture on section 1 of chapter 1. Chapter 1 is entitled Chemistry, the Central Science, and section 1 talks a brief little intro into the study of chemistry just to give you an idea of what we're going to be looking at. And as it says in the textbook here, chemistry is often called the central science because the information that we learn in chemistry can be used for other sciences, such as physics or biology or geology and astronomy. And so it is an important subject. Many of you are probably in the medical field or studying to be in the medical field, and chemistry is essential in the medical field. We're interested primarily in two things in chemistry. We're interested in the study of matter. Those are the things, the material objects that you see around you. Your cell phone, for example, or the computer, or the air around you, or the food that you eat, or the chemicals that are used in medicines. So that's the study of matter. We're also interested in the changes that occur in matter. So, for example, iron rusting. If you see an old nail that's rusted, that's a chemical change. We're interested in that process. Metabolism. So, breaking down and building up molecules in your body. Those are examples of chemical changes that occur. So we're interested in that as well. Now, you are certainly familiar with chemistry from a practical perspective. You observe it every day. So there are some pictures shown here in figure 1.1, an example of a stove, which is using natural gas. That's a chemical process occurring. When you see light emitted through some process, that's an indicator that there could be a chemical reaction occurring. So burning natural gas, of course, is an example of a reaction. That reaction is the case where methane, primarily CH4, is reacting with oxygen gas, which is in the air. And that will form carbon dioxide in water. But also forms heat, right? It produces energy. So that's another aspect of chemistry that you'll discuss in a future course. I mentioned rusting of an iron nail. Well, here's rusting of a can, of a large can that's made out of steel or iron, and that's rusting. You can see the rusting occurring. That's a chemical process. Another example here is the Alka-Seltzer tablet, right? That's a chemical reaction that's producing carbon dioxide gas, and that gas is being emitted and bubbling up through the container, the glass of water. And chemistry of food, cooking, baking, for example, is chemical reactions that are occurring during that process. So there are many examples of these. We don't discuss too much depth, but there is this issue of the scientific method, which is something that you should at least be familiar with. The scientific method is a very practical method that we use for understanding nature and understanding how things around us work, how the universe operates. It's really just a method for analysis, a method for understanding. And it's based essentially on the idea that we make an observation. So, for example, you might make an observation about a piece of metal rusting and seeing that it's rusting. And then we develop an idea, what's called a hypothesis, just an idea, an explanation for maybe why that's happening. So you might have the hypothesis that the reason that the nail is changing color, the reason that it's rusting, is that it's reacting with something in the atmosphere, something in the room. And so that would be a hypothesis. And then you would test it. So you could take that nail or take nails and put them in vacuum chambers and see if they change color, or you could expose them to water and see if they change color, expose them to different gases, and then see, which ones change color in the way that you're observing in your room. And once you have made these experiments, you could, generate support for your hypothesis or rejection. You might reject the hypothesis and have to come up with another one. In general, what happens is over time, if you study a topic enough, you start to notice patterns, and these patterns generally hold to be true. And if there's enough of these patterns, for example, we notice that certain metals rust and other metals do not rust, you might be able to develop something called a law, which is often mathematical, but a relationship that just seems to be true, and we would call that a scientific law. If you then take several laws together, several things that appear to be the case over and over, and develop a real explanation for why these laws are true, and then test these explanations over and over, and different people test them, eventually you can develop what's called a theory. So the theory is actually probably the most demanding of these terms that we would use. The hypothesis is the least demanding. Anybody can come up with a hypothesis. My hypothesis about a piece of iron rusting might be that there are, little robots that are microscopic in size, and they are, at the atomic level or at the molecular level, changing the structure of the surface of that nail. That's a hypothesis. It doesn't really require, it's really just a creative idea. But the theory would require lots and lots of experiments and repeatable experiments that other people could perform, that show that, yes, in fact, there are these tiny little robots that are in the air and they float around and are responsible for the rusting of nails. So a theory is requires much more effort and proof than a hypothesis does. What do molecules look like? So here's a little description here of molecules. Chemistry is a very visual science. You'll notice there's also mathematical, but it's also very visual. The theory of chemistry, or one theory of chemistry, is that matter is made up of little atoms. And these atoms don't have colors, but it can be useful to represent them using colors. So for example, in table 1.1, 12 different elements in nature are shown using these little balls with colors. There's a color code to that. Now, of course, we're not claiming that atoms actually have these colors. Atoms don't really have colors. They're too small to have colors. But hydrogen is represented with a white ball. Notice the hydrogen one is actually smaller. The reason for that is that hydrogen is a very small atom. It's smaller than other atoms, so they decided to go ahead and represent it with a smaller ball here. Boron appears to be pink. Carbon is black. Nitrogen is blue. Oxygen is red. Fluorine is sort of a yellow or green, I guess, a light green. There's no definite requirement that each element be represented by a specific color, but white for hydrogen and black for carbon and blue for nitrogen and red for oxygen, that's very commonly done that way. And so these are different colors to represent these specific atoms. Atoms are essentially little balls. They really are little spheres, not exactly, but pretty close to that. And they connect together, little balls connecting together. So if you look down at the bottom here, figure 1.2, a water molecule represented. It's represented in three different ways. One is by using a chemical formula. We'll talk more about chemical formulas later. H2O, telling us the 2 refers to the number of hydrogen atoms. There's 2 hydrogen atoms. And then there's no number written next to the O. It's not a 0, it's an O. So 1 oxygen atom. If there's no number written next to it, that just means there's 1. So H2O means 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. The molecule, or the substance water, can also be shown with a ball and stick figure. So here, this is actually showing you a little more information. It's showing you that the oxygen is connected to the 2 separate hydrogen atoms. So 1 oxygen atom, 2 hydrogen atoms, using the color code that's up above in table 1.1. in a bent or a V shape, and that's actually the structure of water. Geometrically, it's a bent arrangement. That's something you'll cover in the next course. And then there's also a space-filling structure here. So this is a little more realistic. These balls that are connected to each other are not really connected by little sticks. They're connected directly to each other. And so the space filling, which is shown in figure 1.2c, that model's a little more accurate in terms of what these molecules look like. The problem with those is that those kits that you would use to use space filling are pretty expensive, and so the ball and stick model, which you see in figure B, that's much more common when you go to a chemistry laboratory. So that's pretty much a brief little intro into section 1.1. There aren't really any problems here to talk about. When we get to future sections where there's problems, I'll talk a little bit about those as well. So read through the sections, take notes. It's often not a bad idea to print out, if you can, print out the ebook, put the section in a little 3-ring binder, and then write little notes off to your side and questions off to the side. Any questions you might have based on what you're reading as you go through this section, you can always get in touch with me and ask those questions.